Okay, so welcome to the next set of recorded lectures. I hope that you found that how we managed class last week to be helpful in that you didn't have to read the documents all by yourself, and that you were able to share that information with your classmates and you were able to interact in class over Bacon and Berkeley. And then the part of history that can get a little dragging is something you can do at home where you can get up and give yourself a break. That's my intent, right? So that you can stand up and walk around and go get something to drink or whatever when you feel like you just need to walk away from it. So anyway, so this is the next one. I think these will be a little bit shorter. These certainly aren't, or at least this one is not quite as long. I may go ahead, I'll probably do them in two separate ones just so they'll be a little bit easier. This builds on last week's lecture on the expanding colonies. Again, remember that we're taking a snapshot. We're synopsizing what is, decades and decades of history and development. And, there's entire classes built on colonial America. So we're barely scratching the surface of the differences. So we've established how the colonies are created, kind of, to give you a sense for the differences. Because this is a survey class, I don't go into a huge analysis of the difference between proprietary colonies and royal colonies and joint stock companies and stuff. There's actually a lot more nuance to that than I've given you in a survey class, because I don't think you really absolutely have to know it unless you're going to be a history major. But just know that there are some differences, that ultimately all the colonies end up being royal colonies, regardless of how they got started. That's just a matter of finance, really, because the colonies are part of that mercantilist system where they provide raw materials. This is what we would call a commodity economy or a colonial economy, and we still have those today. Africa struggles with this quite a bit, which is that they provide the raw materials for the more developed countries, the more developed economies, to benefit. And the problem with being a colonial economy is it makes you vulnerable. You're vulnerable to the whims of supply and demand and that kind of thing. And so, this is true in 2015 like it was true in 1700. So keep in mind that that this colonial economy, this process of providing raw materials and then turning around and being a market for finished products, it's not, it's vitally important to the economic success of Great Britain. Great Britain would not be the empire it was without this, okay? So it's hugely important. But for the colonies themselves, it requires a great deal of management, investment, management, that kind of thing. So this is kind of, management is the key word here. And so over time, you need the control of the royal crown. You need kind of that stewardship. And, Berkeley provides an example of that. You need people who are looking at the big picture, that the big picture of how to support a larger economy besides what's happening just there in their colony. And so the royal crown provides this kind of leadership. And so we see that all the colonies end up going to that. In addition, it helps that they can, pull military resources from England as needed, which by the time we finish that, we'll touch on that a little bit more. Oh, excuse me. Sorry. Yesterday was a long day with homecoming parade. All right, so let's get started. Developing colonial regions: New England, Middle, Chesapeake, and Southern. Some people divide them into three. New England, Middle, and Southern. Some people designate the Chesapeake region as being somewhat different, in part because it is a little, also because this is the area that was first settled, and so they kind of, make some allowances for that area being a little bit older. So we'll just kind of work our way through it, and you can decide for yourself if you think we need 3 or 4 regions. The next thing is going to be consolidation. Lack of regulated trade begins to be resolved with the Stuarts. Remember that under Cromwell, you had the first attempts at controlling the flow of raw materials. Once the Stuart monarchy comes in, that gets even more so. The Navigation Acts get more detailed. And remember, the whole purpose of the Navigation Acts is to control where the raw materials made in the colonies are going. So they can't just ship them to France, or they can't just trade with the Dutch, right? That it has to go to England first. And then to make sure that these colonists don't get objects or items from other countries, that they're buying all their finished products from England. This is the whole point of mercantilism. This is why you have to understand what that is. And in addition, this is part of how they can do those tobacco credits. Because if everything's running through England, then you're not going to have any kind of additional currency. Now, what we'll find out is they do tend to have a degree of smuggling. There does tend to be a secondary economy and a secondary market that emerges. But officially on the books, there should just be the one. So you have the Navigation Acts. There is an early attempt by the Stuart monarchy to kind of centralized power in the colonies, and I only bring this up because it's interesting to note that even the Crown began to realize that we got a lot of different things going. I mean, that the colonies were very different, that certain colonies were better at producing tobacco, and other colonies were better at shipping, and maybe we need to have a centralized authority to maybe kind of manage this whole system and make sure that everyone's benefiting each other. And so they attempt to centralize authority in the colonies. And it fails miserably very quickly. I mean, I think it's only around for like 5, 6, 7 years, something like that. The colonials are just like, no, we don't want to answer to some leader. I think, gosh, I'm having to dig in my brain here. I think it was stationed in New York, I think. But it was somewhere far away, so that like the ones in the South, like South Carolina, their argument was, the people controlling me are so far away, and that's not fair, right? So you kind of get where this message comes from. So the colonists didn't want centralized authority. I think it's very important to remember that this is a fundamental part of American history. Americans are not comfortable with government. Even though we have one, and we have one that arguably in the 21st century is very strong and very powerful, what you see is that we have always historically asked the question of how much government is too much government, and we're constantly trying to figure that out. So that goes all the way back to our colonial heritage. You're also going to see the other big thing that happens. You have a little detail called the Glorious Revolution. This is a very English history, world history kind of concept, but it's probably the last. Would I say the last? No, I won't say the last. It's one of the last. It's one of the last 2 or 3 major events in Europe that's really going to affect how the United States, or how the colonies are run. So what will happen essentially is that because the Stuart monarchy, the party king aside, right, the Stuart monarchy comes in and they keep trying to assert royal authority, right? And we still have this power struggle between Parliament and between the Crown. And Parliament finally has had enough. And so in 1688, so this is not very long after Cromwell, the Lord Protector, let's do away with kings, all that kind of stuff. Parliament essentially invites William of Orange and his wife Mary, who is one of the Stuarts, okay, invites them to come over and take over the throne. So they basically invite them to come over. They kick out James, King James. By that time, Charles had a son, James. And so basically he says, fine, I'm out, right? Really, he's afraid he's going to get beheaded because that's what happened the last time Parliament asserted its authority, right? They beheaded his grandfather, or great-grandfather, rather. And so he's basically, that's fine, I'm out of here. So he leaves, and his sister and her husband come in, and they take over the crown. And this is the reign of William and Mary, and they're co-regents, right? Because Mary is the Stuart. And William of Orange is from kind of those upper Germanic states. and he's Protestant, and so everything's going to get along. And part of this invitation towards William and Mary is, hey, you can come over and become king and queen, but when you do, you're basically agreeing to balance power with the crown. And so that's what they say. So the process of the Glorious Revolution is this peaceful takeover by Parliament, and kind of a peaceful redesigning of how the English crown operates within English government. And so this is really the beginning of kind of decentralizing the power of the crown. Now, don't think that meant the king had no power, because the king and queen still did have some power. But they definitely are in a position to have to work much more closely with Parliament and with the legislative body than any other monarch around Europe does. And this is all based on negotiation and compromise, and like I said, this invitation from Parliament, hey, come take over, and let's kick out James. So when William and Mary come in, we kind of have the dust settling in England after, really what has essentially been 50 years of chaos, right? Of who's in charge and different kings and all this conflict. So you finally begin to see that the crown starts to assert some attempt at organization, knowing that the Dominion of New England had failed under the Stuart monarchy. So they begin to create what they call Vice Admiralty courts. Vice Admiralty courts are tied to the Navy. There's kind of a military flavor to them. And the essence of this is that because everything having to do with the colonies is tied into the Navy and into shipping, that the authority for people who are involved in smuggling or anything like that is going to fall to the Vice Admiralty courts. So, you commit a crime, and if it's a basic, on land crime, that will be handled within the colonies themselves. But if you commit a major crime, a serious crime, and the courts in the colonies can't handle it, or if it involves shipping, right, you're smuggling or something, then that gets bumped to the Vice Admiralty courts back in England. So understand that that's where these come from, and that this is a little different kind of judicial aspect. When we talk about the Constitution, we'll talk about how this legal, who's going to determine guilt and innocence, and where are the courts held. This is a big deal for our founding fathers. The Board of Trade regulates goods and products, and what raw materials come out of the colonies, what finished products go in. You do have an increasing royal control, but the royal control relies heavily on colonial representatives, because the colonies, they're so independent and they are so crucial to the strength of the English economy, that what you see is that, okay, fine, as long as you're willing to work with us. And so you see kind of this Berkeley system of that royal governor and his council, and how letting them manage the difficult and ornery colonials, and then they kind of provide that buffer zone with the royal control. And so they really kind of embrace that system. And the last point I want to make here, so is British control so bad? Remember that by and large, this is the type of system that colonials kept saying that they wanted. They didn't want, centralized royal control. They wanted this kind of disseminated process where they felt like they had some say in what was going on in their colony. And think back to the Bacon and Berkeley discussion. Was Berkeley really stepping out of line? We can point to the flaws that he had. He certainly had favorites. He certainly, was looking out for himself to some degree. He certainly valued Jamestown and its people more than he valued the people on the frontier. But the whole essence of Bacon's Rebellion is, how can we push back and make sure that our representatives are listening to us? And I think in that respect, we can look at Bacon's Rebellion and say that it was true, that he was accurate in the flaws in the system, and that he pointed those out. And that you then see that the colony of Virginia responds by listening a little bit more to what the people on the frontier need. And they do. Now, it's not the system that Bacon proposed, but it is definitely far more representative and inclusive of them than it was before. And of course, we mentioned in class, or I think I did I think 4B, I might have missed this point with y'all. that this is why they start turning to slavery more, right? If they're going to have to start listening to these people on the frontier, these former indentured servants, then let's stop bringing so many of those people in. Let's stop, expanding that part of the population, and let's rely for cheap labor on slavery, because those people aren't going to be able to demand anything. And just to be sure, because remember, there were, if you remember from tab 4 of the live binders, part of the men in Bacon's army included some freed blacks. And so one of the ways that they keep that from happening is, let's solidify our laws about slavery and making sure this is a perpetual state and that these people can't get out of slavery. So now we don't have to worry about adding to the number of these freed peoples that live on the frontier that are going to try to pressure us for more say in the government. So you've got a couple of nuances that happen in this whole process. But again, this comes back to the idea, is British control really so bad? Is it really that awful? I mean, obviously Bacon's rebellion was able to accomplish what the people on the frontier wanted. Obviously, the colony of Virginia recovered from Bacon's rebellion and came back strong. So is it really so awful? And this is 1688. This is, roughly, 70 years before the Revolution. And at this point, people are thinking, yeah, we got this whole thing figured out. So I think it's important to kind of realize that it wasn't so bad. These are just this is kind of a map that shows you the 13 British colonies. And if you zoom in, you can see some of the information there. And nothing super exciting. It does break down. I'm looking for my magnifying thing. Anyways, it does kind of break down a little bit. Let's see, does it zoom? Come on, zoom. I don't know if it is zooming. I don't think it is. Oh, well. Okay, never mind. But it does kind of show, if you look on this side, it talks about the religious perspective, and you kind of get a sense for how, how the southern colonies had religion was not of big importance to them. And you can kind of see some of the geographic elements here. The Appalachian Mountains, which run right along here, are a big part of why the frontier kind of gets stalled out a little bit. We'll talk about that. Okay, I don't know what I just did. We'll talk about that more when we look at the Proclamation line of 1763 and why that tends to happen. I'm still looking for my stinking magnifying glass. Zoom in. There we go. Control Alt plus. That would be why. There we go. Thank you. Okay. Sorry. So yes, you can see here the Appalachian Mountains. That kind of creates that fall. It's just down there, fall line of settlements. These are going to be the southern colonies. These are the middle colonies. These are the New England colonies right there. Kind of gives you a sense. You also get a sense that all the major cities are here along the East Coast. And then you can also, like I said, this shows you some of the religious aspects. You can see right here in this kind of Pennsylvania region, we have a lot of diversity. And so that's just kind of a interesting way to see that happening, the diversity that's going on in the colonies. I'm sure you can pull up the actual PowerPoint from my webpage and zoom that in if you really want to go into detail. So the Chesapeake region, which is Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina, or as I tried to say, Vamaland or something, whatever it was I was trying to pronounce. Anyways, so they're producing tobacco as their cash crop in the 1600s and 1700s. Remember, the cotton gin is not invented until 1791. So while you might have some cotton being planted, and you don't have wide-scale production. Now, this is not a cash crop, okay? Tobacco is definitely a cash crop up there. They're heavily devoted to that. Of course, remember that it really depletes the soil, it damages the soil, and so this heavy focus in this particular part of the colonies is going to deplete that soil so much so that by the time you get to the late 1700s, early 1800s, this region where slavery began, where cash crop economies began, is really going to be played out. And this, of course, factors into the overall slave story that we'll be talking about with Northup. You have very difficult conditions. Male life expectancy still was not particularly great, because the farther out on the frontier you were, the more likely you were to be damaged. The emergence of slavery. You had a number of conflicts with the Powhatan Confederacy. Those tend to wane over the years as we exert more royal control and that kind of thing. Eventually, grain becomes more profitable. The tobacco market is very volatile. And they figure out in Virginia, Maryland, and North Carolina that the slave colonies, and specifically the Caribbean islands, are desperate for grain to feed their slave populations. Their slave populations are exploding, and because, especially in the Caribbean, they use every amount of space. Remember, they're islands, so they're somewhat limited. They use all their space for sugar production. Which means they don't have any resources to grow foodstuffs. And so this really starts to become a breadbasket. And they start providing the grain for these slave economies because they're a little bit closer. So just kind of keep that in mind, that you start to have that transition from tobacco and cash crop to more traditional kind of diversified grain production. All of this, though, means that there's a lack of industry. We don't have a lot of industrial things going on. We don't have a ton of cities being built. You still have social status is tied very directly to land holding and to people that own the larger plantations. So the ones that live out on the frontier that have the small farms, they don't have the same kind of high social status. And we'll see that even, as we have time to look at who were some of the leaders in the American Revolution. The clear, talking heads of the Revolution are these wealthy landowners, the George Washingtons, the Thomas Jeffersons. Even though a lot of your more practical, in the field kind of leadership comes from the smaller farmers, the social status that landholding conveys is still incredibly important. The benefit to solidifying racial laws and slave codes is that you create a racial division between the frontier whites and blacks. Because now a frontier white that has this little bitty farm out on the frontier can save up money to buy a black slave, and he'll own that black slave his entire life, and he's better than that black slave because that black slave will never be able to aspire to anything. And think about that prior to Bacon's Rebellion, that you might have a black indentured servant, but eventually that person would be free and he would be equal to you. So that very knowledge is going to shape the way you interact and perceive that other person. So racial divisions become much harder. You have improved opportunities for white males because of the adjustments to the political system that they begin to make, where even smaller landowners have an opportunity to be a part of the colonial government and work their way kind of up. I mean, they're never at the top of the social ladder, but they're certainly able to be active in the social arena, much more so than they were, prior to Bacon's Rebellion. So as the economy stabilizes away from tobacco production, and as just the whole area kind of stabilizes after Bacon's Rebellion, you have more and more families coming in. You have more women from England. And so the region really kind of settles down from that very kind of chaotic period that happened, from 1607, all the way up to roughly, 1688. So you've got that whole, this is a much better place to live. And again, don't forget that this is true for blacks as well as for whites. I think I mentioned when we introed Northup that slaves on the East Coast, in Virginia and Maryland, that by the time you get to the early 1800s, they've actually survived and even thrived in the slave system. Even though it's codified and it's perpetual and your children are born into slavery, even though those things were all true, even family units among black slaves are stabilized, and there's a degree of, a degree of individualism. Many of the slaves, because the Chesapeake region turns to grain farming as opposed to tobacco production, even their slaves begin to be what we would call skilled labor. They're trained in craftsman type things. How do you make barrels? How do you repair farm equipment? How do you, that kind of thing. And so slave life on the East Coast, thanks in part to these developing changes, it becomes very different than what it will be under cotton production, and even what it was under tobacco production. So just kind of keep in mind that this stability and this increase in families is not just for whites, it's for blacks too. So remember the economics of it, that we want to find a way to include the poor whites into the system, make them feel a little less vulnerable economically, make them feel more a part of the government, because if they're bought in, then they're not going to rise up. Remember the idea of deference, that the one thing that the wealthy landowners, the Berkeleys, so to speak, managed to get out of Bacon's Rebellion is they maintain the system of deference, which is that the wealthy, the big planters, the big landowners, still somehow manage to be at the top of the social ladder. Even though there's opportunities towards the middle and bottom of the social ladder for poor whites, they can never attain, although they hold out the promise, hey, you get enough land, you get enough slaves, and guess what, you too can be at the top of the social ladder. So they have that kind of distant promise sitting out there, but by and large it's only the wealthiest individuals that have a chance. Women will begin to have less power, because as the family unit stabilizes, as the government stabilizes, as more women come in, women are less, they're less rare, which is going to mean that that women don't typically get the chance to choose who their husbands are going to be. Their opportunity to inherit wealth gets taken away from them. They start to legislate inheritance laws that keeps widows from inheriting these large tracts of land when their husband dies, because remember, men tended to die fairly young. And so you have all of that kind of happening. So women will start to lose power in Virginia, even though one could argue that at the earliest points of colonization, say the 1620s and 1630s, women had more power in Virginia. By the time you get to the 1720s, they have less power. And they're really operating in kind of a system that's very reminiscent of what they have in England, which is that women are, at the higher end of the social ladder. They're simply there to help reproduce and make heirs, and just, to look pretty. And at the lower end of the social ladder, they're there to make heirs and then also work to be labor. And so that doesn't really change anymore in Virginia. Territory-wise, Indians are pushed away. Obviously, Indian conflict becomes less and less, but that's because the Indians have left. They've moved out west. They've said, forget it, we can't reclaim this land, and they just accept it as a loss. And remember, you've got the Appalachian Mountains there that are kind of operating as something of a barrier, holding the white settlement back a little bit, and so they get on the other side of that, and they're hoping that the Appalachians will continue to hold the white settlers away, which obviously it won't, but more on that later. The southern colonies, which are going to be dominated by South Carolina and Georgia at this juncture. Shh, my Yorkie's starting to growl. Anyways, the southern colonies, South Carolina and Georgia, they very much have elements of the Caribbean culture. You have sugar. It's a dominant product in these regions. Later, rice. You're going to have some cotton production coming on in those areas. So not a lot of tobacco. The land's not good for tobacco there. Sugar is the big one, because that's the one where, the Caribbeans are making tons of money. They have slavery there like they do in the Chesapeake, but it's very different. Their slavery there does not encourage craftsmen or skilled kind of slave labor. It is all purely, back-breaking, grunting, sugar production, which is incredibly dangerous. There's a couple of elements of sugar production that do require some amount of skill and knowledge, but they often really controlled who had access to those jobs. So most of your slave labor with sugar is really just kind of your basic, here, go chop down that plant. And so it's much difficult. The way they structure slavery is very different in the southern colonies. When we do our Colonial Life project this week, there's going to be a group that focuses just on slavery, and they'll see that it's kind of that they'll highlight those differences, or they should, between slavery and, say, the Chesapeake region and slavery in the Deep South. And so it's very different. Now notice that we're really only talking about South Carolina and Georgia at this point. It won't take very long after the American Revolution for we're moving westward, and you're talking about Louisiana and Mississippi and all these other places. And those places will copy South Carolina and Georgia and the way they operated their slavery and that kind of thing. And keep in mind that Georgia was initially started trying to keep slavery from spreading, but obviously it fails miserably. You do have an Indian conflict there. Remember, Georgia especially was intended to be a buffer zone, and so you're going to see that they have an Indian conflict in 1715. Oh, excuse me. The Yamasee War. Obviously, the colonists win that, but that does kind of slow some of the development of the southern colonies, and it makes them a little less, diversified, like we see in Chesapeake, because they're still having to fight Indians. Very harsh climate and conditions in South Carolina and Georgia. It's not for the faint of heart. There's a reason why the slave population is so large in those two colonies, and why the white population is so small, because it is not a fun place to live. Now, over time, I would say its trajectory is a little bit shorter than what you see in the Chesapeake region, as far as improving the conditions, but it's still a very harsh place to live. So just kind of keep that in mind, and understand that when I say they transplant the Caribbean culture, they really and truly do, to the point that they use slave codes, for instance, which I'll get to here in a second. The southern colonies have less industry than the Chesapeake, if that's remotely possible. They are completely dependent on trade with England, because all they produce is raw materials. They produce sugar and rice, and that's it, right? And so everything has to come from either England or from New England, which is often coming directly from England. They never diversify, and I completely misspelled this, never diversifies agriculture. Obviously, I was editing this and lost my train of thought. Anyways, they never diversify agriculture. And so you very much have what we call a planter culture, which is that you have really large, extremely wealthy planters, right? People that have so much money, because they're the ones that own all this land and they benefit from all the sugar, and they are the main part of society there. You have a very small group of kind of smaller farmers, but they are not a large group, and they are completely overshadowed by the planter class. So just kind of understand that the lack of diversification in agriculture actually cuts out any sort of middling group of people. And so what you end up with are the extremely wealthy and the extremely poor in the form of slaves. And so your social ladder is not even really a ladder. You've got like 2, maybe 3 tiers, and that's all there is to it. There's nothing complex about it. There's nothing to aspire to. This is part of why this part of the South really becomes known as kind of an aristocracy, because they absolutely run their territory like that. There's these essentially kind of this concept of lords of the manor existing that control so much of everything else, with the exception of like Charleston, for instance, or maybe later Savannah, when you have cities that kind of develop, but they're really the only 2 cities in this region. And so you do have some middling people in those cities, but when you get out on the frontier, it's all about the planters and it's all about the slaves. The southern colonies bring in the very harsh and strict slave codes of the Caribbean, which are incredibly brutal. The process of torture and whipping and you name it, the harshness of it. And I hope that the slave group manages to bring out what some of those slave codes were because the whites are so outnumbered, they have to rely on these slave codes. The Caribbean had the same issue. Huge group of enslaved people from Africa. And one of the things that they do is they intentionally mix tribal groups to create communication problems. So that's one trick that they use. But eventually those tribes will figure out a way to communicate with each other. The other thing that they do is the work is extremely dangerous. It leads to very short lifespans. It's very difficult for children to thrive in this environment. And so they're having this kind of constant attrition rate that requires them to constantly resupply the number of slaves. But this is one way that they kind of keep the slaves kind of off balance. But then if that doesn't work, they have extremely harsh punishments for anybody that doesn't do their job, or anybody who fails to, tries to start a rebellion. Those people are going to be tortured, have, hands cut off, that kind of thing. So those codes get brought over. And in fact, this is where kind of the notion of using the whip as a way of driving production, of driving and managing this particular group of people, this is where it comes from. It's really pretty horrible. You do have an early attempt called the Stono Rebellion that was an attempt to kind of get back at some of the white owners in the southern colonies. It falls apart, though. But the fear of rebellion and the slave codes are a big part. And these colonies are pretty simple because there's not a lot of complexity. You've got really, two groups going on here, and the struggle between them and outside of them. Next, you're going to have the middle colonies. The middle colonies are going to be places like Pennsylvania and New Jersey, New York. The Beaver Wars that we talked about last week, that is going to basically cause a number of Indian migrations. The Iroquois win that, and their domination of that region makes them the key group that the English will treaty with. But it also means that you have a lot of Indian migrations that start to leave the area. The middle colonies have a much better climate. Their climate is much more conducive to settlement. An incredibly diverse agriculture. They too are part of that breadbasket. Now they're the breadbasket before the Chesapeake is, right? Because the Chesapeake takes a little while to figure out, tobacco's not very profitable. The middle colonies from the get-go are producing grain and all this kind of stuff to feed the communities that rely so heavily on slave labor. They have the highest rates of immigration. Everybody wants to go there because it's a better place to live, right? I mean, you don't want to go to South Carolina. It's miserable down there. And you still have Indian attacks and all that kind of stuff. Well, up here you don't have this. And so you have lots of immigration because the environment is so much friendlier. Women are having 6 to 8 kids apiece, so you've got really high birth rates. So this is just a population explosion among white population. You have a lot of towns. You still have a couple of big cities. Philadelphia is a big city. New York City is a big city. But you also have a ton of just little small towns because you've got so much immigration coming in. And you've got a huge middle class of professionals and merchants. So this is a highly diversified economy. In fact, you don't really have, you're going to have a few large landowners and a few people that are kind of the big wigs of the community. But for the most part, what you have is this huge group of middle class that are really the backbone of this particular community in the middle colonies. Very traditional families, lots of families because there's a huge population. And religious tolerance. If you remember from the map I showed you just a little bit ago, that area has a ton of religious diversity. And so the general attitude is, well, we have to tolerate everybody because everybody believes something a little bit different. And then, of course, I pose the question, why does a thriving middle class matter? Think about the southern colonies and the fact that you really only have 2 levels, that you're not going to have. There's just nothing to aspire to. You're either in the one class and life is great, or you're in the other class and life is miserable. There's zero aspiration. And if you don't aspire, if you don't think you can improve your lot in life, or if your life is so great that there's nowhere to go, I mean, what motives do you have to change anything, really? And so I think that's a very compelling point, that this area of Philadelphia and New York, this kind of the center of really the American colonies, has this huge middle class that wants to make better, that wants to do more, that wants to be a part, that wants opportunity. And everything about what they're doing is about how to make life better for my kids, how to make life better for me. And there's just this huge driving sense of, I can make a difference. And I think that that's why a thriving middle class matters. It also matters because you have increased literacy. When you have a middle class always values education. They will teach their kids to read and write, and that will become incredibly important before the revolution. In fact, rates of literacy in the American colonies are higher than they are in England. And why? Because we have a huge thriving middle class. They want their kids to do better, and they want their kids to be able to read. And so unless you're talking about South Carolina, where the only people that can read are the wealthy landowners, every other colony in the American colonies, it has a high literacy rate, and this is all because of the middle class. And so be sure you keep that in mind as well. New England, we've already talked about them quite a bit. You've got Plymouth, Massachusetts. Those are the areas. Eventually Plymouth kind of gets subsumed into Massachusetts, so it all becomes Massachusetts. They continue to have very tight-knit communities that are centered around the church. You have a lot of family farms. Every family in the church receives a house lot and some farm acreage. The dominance there is on male land ownership. This ties back to their religious beliefs and the idea that they kind of model God the Father, which equates to the man of the household, and then everything below that is supportive, and there's like a hierarchy. So this husband, father, wife, mother, children, particularly oldest children first, male children first. And so there's like this family hierarchy that happens. And there's a lot of emphasis on tying this into respecting the authority of God, who's, the God the Father over Christ Jesus, that kind of thing. So lots of very tight-knit communities tied to these religious beliefs, tied to family units. That because they're giving away so many family lots, this limits the size of the farms. So, in, say, Pennsylvania, because you have so many people, so much immigration coming in, there's not room. They don't need slaves because there's so many people wanting to be there to farm that there's no need for that, right? Now, in Chesapeake and the southern colonies, they need slave labor because they can't get as many people to come in. In New England, the issue is a little bit different. It's not that people don't want to come there. It's that they're tied to the church, to the Congregationalist church. And it decides who gets what family plots. And there's so many families there that they're just not big enough to need slavery. It's not that they have a huge religious objection to it. Now, in the middle colonies, like the Quakers, do have a religious objection to slavery. So they're never going to own slaves for that purpose alone. Now, the Puritans are not going to be that particular. But they just don't have a need to because they've got all these little family units. And that's what they're trying to do. Remember, they're trying to build the city upon a hill. They have much longer lifespans. Their society has always been more stable, going back to 1619. They're much more stable. And so it tends to encourage longer life. Churches receive the tax money and control morality. But the churches technically don't own property. So in that sense, they try to break the tradition of the Catholic Church, where the Catholic Church actually owned property. However, note that the Puritan churches do get a portion of tax money, and the taxes are required. You don't have a choice not to donate to the church. And so really, through the 1600s, church leadership dominates the government. Over time, though, as the royal crown starts to exert more authority, and the Salem witchcraft trials play a role in this as well. But you'll start to see that church leaders start to move out of government and focus instead on local politics, local control. Like I said, controlling that morality, making sure the families are okay. There's a lot of, because church membership is a requirement for voting, you have a huge number of people that have a vote and a say in their colonial government. And they focus a lot on town meetings, on kind of this idea of you have local control, and you have representatives that go to the colony, and then they vote in the legislature. And so you kind of have these early ways of the individuals having a say in how the colonies run, which, keep in mind, this is nothing like what they have in England, right? In England, you can own property and not have any say over how the person that represents your little district, how they vote in the parliament. So that may have nothing to do with anything. But in New England and the Chesapeake and the colonies, you absolutely are able to be this little bitty farmer out on the frontier or out away from town, and you can go in and you can have a say with your representative as to what they're going to vote for the whole colony. So that kind of system of government is very different. So just kind of know that New England is dominated by the church, but we do see that the church moves out of that system. You have it's very restricted on how the land can expand, and so this will become a problem later on when we talk about the early 1800s. The limited amount of land, the fact that all these little farms are owned by various families, that's going to limit in the long term economic development of New England. In the short term, it's a good thing, right? I mean, it means there's kind of everyone's the same economic level, all this kind of stuff. But in the long term, it's going to limit their ability to diversify and to develop their economy, which is kind of interesting if you think about socialism. A lot of the New England colonies are predicated on this idea that we're all equal, and yet, like with socialism and communism, we see that long term that does indeed actually kind of hurt economic development. So very traditional family structure, very little powerful women in these families. Like I said, women in New England had almost, they focused on the family, and that was it. And that was, if they had any authority at all, it was based on what their husband was willing for them to have. And so just kind of keep that in mind, that really in the scope of the different colonies, you ironically have probably less powerful women in New England, because a lot of it was dominated by men in the church. The Salem witchcraft trials, which we have a particular group that will talk about that, so I'm not going to dive into that really. Just know that for New England, the Salem witchcraft trials are big because it pushes the church leadership out of civil government. And we kind of see that's where this break comes. It's also one of the last instances of witchcraft trials in the world. And so if you're into gender studies, or if you study, global witchcraft hunting, this is important in that sense. You do have some problems with Indians as immigration and birth rates expand the population, because remember, they're giving family farms to everybody, and so that's going to create some problems. A lot of these issues with Indians, though, are resolved by the 1700s. And the Pequot War, that kind of thing is a part of this. Lots of diverse farming, heavy on the fishing, shipping, manufacturing. Of course, this is, trade manufacturing. This is in-house, right? Skilled. You have a shoemaker, or you have a leather maker, or barrel maker, and they, their business is right there at their house. So when I say manufacturing, I'm not talking about industry. I'm talking about individual manufacturing. They are heavily involved in the triangle trade because of their connection to shipping and fishing, which means that New England is tied to the slave system. They are part of that triangle that ships products to England, and then England goes to Africa, then Africa comes to the colonies, and then they come back to New England. So just kind of keep that in mind. Lots and lots of towns. Wealthy are at the top of the social ladder, but you still have a large group of artisans and professionals. And again, the prevalence of towns allows people to interact and communicate with each other. You also are going to have, people can go to the tavern and get the local news. You're going to have the same literacy impact. You're going to have the same aspirational impact, all based around the middle class and the town. And the growth of towns and the growth of population will weaken the religious hold, in addition to the Salem witchcraft trials. And you have, when the person that covers the Great Awakening should hopefully, that group should talk about halfway covenants and this idea of how can we include church membership, that kind of thing. So be sure that you're kind of thinking of that. But they do attempt to, basically what they do is they lower their standards of church membership, because they've got so many different people coming in, and their attempt to maintain church leadership in politics means that they basically water down their requirements for church membership, and that ends up hurting them in the long run as well. And because they think that if they keep church membership up, then they're going to continue to be able to have a pull with what's going on. And then lastly, almost lastly, note that all these regions and colonies develop their own systems of government regardless of the form with which the colony initially started. So regardless of whether it's joint stock, regardless of whether it's the Puritans, they come over here and they start developing a unique political system that's meant to change, increase representation. You see them kind of working within the royal influence. And so they all become very independent. Very, focused on how they want to govern themselves. And that level of independence is incredibly important. Economic growth challenges founding principles. If you talk about the religious principles of New England, growth is going to cause them to have to revisit, well, what exactly is church membership? In Pennsylvania and Delaware, this issue of, well, how do we relate to the Indians, right? What you're going to see is that relationships with Indians, whether it's they're all pushed out so we don't fight with them anymore vis-a-vis Virginia, or whether we have to have more land, so forget that we're going to treat the Indians fairly because, we have to have their land. So those things are going to change. Georgia, in its attempt to not have slavery, that changes. So you have agriculture being hugely important in each region, whether it's a breadbasket colony, whether it's a sugar colony, or whether it's New England. And the fact that you have nothing but small family farms leads them into relying heavily on shipping. Agriculture changes the way each colony develops as well. And all of this ties into the social systems and how people interact. And note that there's a lot of this that changes from the early 1600s to the 1700s. So just kind of keep in mind that we're in colonies that are going through a great deal of flux and change and that kind of thing. So let's see. Now back in England, the Glorious Revolution brings William and Mary to be monarchs. Parliament's really in control. I misspelled invites, I think. Yes. And so Parliament's really in charge. Now that's important because when we look at the Declaration of Independence, and it talks about the fact that they address it to the king, and yet the king has not really been in control since 1688. So that's an interesting kind of thought to stick in your head. So Parliament's the dominant thing. Many of the proprietors, that kind of quid pro quo from the Stuart period, where the Stuarts paid people back that had supported them, they remove a lot of those proprietors, and they put royal, like the Board of Trade, in control. You get a privy council and admiralty courts. You have royal governors. So really they replicate the Virginia system all throughout the colonies. And so once they get that kind of in place, you have this period of what we call salutary neglect, which is, you have lots of movement of product coming from the colonies into England and finished products going back to the colonies. And you have these navigation acts that are meant to restrict any kind of outside trade. But royal control is very busy with raising funds. There's also some conflicts in Europe over royal crowns and that kind of stuff. Nothing that we really have to worry about. But it does kind of distract Parliament and William and Mary and then later Queen Anne from really tightening their control. We'll also see that William and Mary, they have one daughter, Anne. Anne marries but never has any children. And so then they have another crisis of who's going to be the king. And this leads them to bring the Hanovers over. And so this is where the King Georges come from. In fact, the current royal family is from the Hanover line, not from the Stuart line. So just kind of keep that in mind, that all of this leads to England, while they set up this system, once we get rid of this whole crisis with the Stuarts and the Cromwells and the Roundheads, all that kind of stuff, once that settles down with William and Mary, they're able to create a system that functions and does a really good job of allowing the colonies some degree of independence, and yet at the same time creating some sort of centralized control. But unfortunately, they get distracted, and so they don't ever pay a whole lot of attention. And what this does is this allows for the colonies to have a lot of freedom to do what they want. That essentially that the colonies are able to smuggle and ship with France and with islands in the Caribbean, regardless of what European power they belong to. And so really the colonies can do what they want as long as they on the surface, and as long as the majority of what they're doing follows the Navigation Acts, then they can, with what little bit is left, the Crown's not going to pay attention to, which for the colonists is great. They can do what they want. They basically have this structure in place that as long as they follow it, to some extent, in name only, then they can get away with whatever they want. So we have a healthy smuggling economy going on here, and this is kind of what's going to happen. American society and government is incredibly unique. That's the big thing of this PowerPoint, is it develops, it changes. What was brought over here when they initially founded the colonies does not stay. It adapts and it changes after Bacon's Rebellion, as tobacco depletes, all this kind of stuff. And so you have a unique culture that's being made. And it's not simply Englishmen being transplanted over here, although many of the American colonists saw themselves as Englishmen and Englishwomen. The system was in place to govern the colonies. It was just not utilized to the best of its ability. We'll see that England will start to figure that out, but it takes them a few decades. And the colonies get very, very used to all of this and to being able to make as much money as they want, this opportunity, this aspiration, all that kind of thing. The last thing I'm going to touch on is the French and Indian War, and I'm not going to go into a whole lot of detail about this because we have a group that will look into the French and Indian War. I just want to mention you had a number of minor skirmishes going on in the first half of the 1700s. Nothing that was hugely impactful for the Americans. But know that you have the French, creating a stronger presence in New France, a lot more military, because they see the growth that's happening in the English colonies and they're a little nervous about it. So they think, well, let's send some more soldiers and some more tradesmen. And they do, but what this means is they start setting up forts in areas that, especially if you get up around Virginia, the colonists want to get past the Appalachian Mountains. And so they start looking to some of that land and start exploring it. And lo and behold, they find that the French are already setting up forts there, trying to prepare to stop English expansion. And this is going to create some frustration. And so that you're going to have Virginians who are land speculating. They want to get at the French Fort Duquesne, which I'm probably mispronouncing. George Washington actually leads this fight, loses to the French, and this becomes kind of the triggering moment of the French and Indian War. It's called the French and Indian War on this side of the Atlantic, and on the other side of the Atlantic it's called the 7 Years' War. And on the other side of the Atlantic it's tied into some monarchical power struggles and stuff, but for our purposes, it's tied directly to the French presence and into land expansion. That we want to get rid of the French because then that will open up more land to the east, and that means more opportunity to make money, more, and remember, we're starting to get a pretty heavy population going on the one side of the Appalachian Mountains. And so the French and Indian War will involve most of Europe. It'll involve the colonies. It'll involve Indian nations. Some would argue that this is really your first world war. And it's incredibly important. It's incredibly important because it begins to change the relationship of the colonies with Great Britain in a way that they would not have been before. And this begins to be the end of salutary neglect and that kind of thing. All right, so that's it for Developing Colonial Regions. I'm coming in just under an hour. I'm sure you're thrilled and excited by that. And so I think that's it, and we will see you later.